Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you. Thanks for joining us from wherever you are joining. Today is September 11th, 2025, and I'd like to welcome you to our second webinar in this series focused on a history of people, forests, and forestry. This series is co-hosted by the Forest School at the Yale School of the Environment, the Forest History Society, the Society of American Foresters, and the University of Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. My name is Tanya Muntz, and I am the president and CEO of the Forest History Society, and we are based in Durham, North Carolina in the US. I am one of your hosts of this series, and I will be introducing today's webinar. So now let me introduce the co-hosts for this History of People, Forests, and Forestry series. First, on the left of the slide, you can see Terry Baker. Terry is the CEO of the Society of American Foresters, and he is based in Washington, D.C. Our second co-facilitator is Dr. Mike Dockery. Mike is the Associate Professor of Forest Resources at the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota, which is where he is based. And then our final co-host is Gary Dunning, and Gary is the Executive Director of the Forest School at the Yale School of the Environment, based in New Haven, Connecticut, also in the US. So let me tell you a little bit more about the series. As you know, this YFF webinar series will explore histories of people, forests, and forestry. And as you can see on this slide, we have a really wonderful slate of speakers and themes that we've lined up for you over the next 4 months. You'll also see there's a couple of gaps that we're working to fill, so stay tuned as we fill those slots with excellent speakers for you as well. Just a couple of reminders on our series logistics. We convene this series on Thursdays from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Time, US time, through the beginning of December. And the webinar presentations run for roughly 30 minutes or so, and then we always allow audience Q&A to follow that. So we invite you to submit questions. Please remember that your questions should be typed into the Zoom's Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom interface. Each session in the series will be recorded, and we make transcripts available on the Yale Forest Forum's website shortly after the session. If you have any questions related to the series, please email us at yff@yale.edu. And now I am happy to introduce today's speaker, Kieko Matteson. Kieko is Associate Professor and Department Chair of the Department of History at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. Born and raised in Vermont, Kieko Matteson is a forest historian of early modern and modern France. Her research explores the intersections between environmental policy, state power, and socio-political change in 18th and 19th century France. Her first book, titled Forests in Revolutionary France, Conservation, Community, and Conflict, 1669 to 1848, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. She is a graduate of Smith College and Yale University, where she did her MA and PhD degrees, and we are delighted to have her with us today. Kieko's talk today is titled Wood Famine and the Development of State Forestry in Early Modern France. Kieko, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Well, Tanya, thank you so much for that very nice introduction. And I just got to say, it's an honor to be a part of this Yale Forest Forum celebrating 125 years of the Yale School of the Environment, and as I understand it, 125 years as well of the Society of American Foresters. My talk today segues nicely from Keith Plumer's presentation last week on medieval and early modern English forestry and its Atlantic expansion. And picking up where Keith left off in the 17th century with rising fears of timber scarcity and increasing efforts to adjudicate forests for perpetual supply, I turn to France, where 3 overlapping phenomena over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries drove the development of a top-down narrowly focused, extractive model of forest governance that would shape woodland management regimes in France and beyond well into the 20th centuries. So now I'm going to share my slides. Hopefully that works. Okay. That, by the way, is not a woodland scene from France, but rather from Vermont, where my heart actually lies. Okay, so the three phenomena that I just mentioned that form the backdrop of this talk are the mounting pressure on forests from military and industrial demand and demographic growth, the centralization of administrative control, first under the absolutist monarchy of Louis XIV and later under the Revolution and Napoleonic Empire, and the rise of highly rigid and uniform methods of exploitation and management instilled in laws that prioritized the strategic and economic interests of the crown, and later the state, over the needs of rural communities, and which, in turn, were shaped by Enlightenment ideas of rational improvement that sought to impose order on the natural world. Now, that's a lot to cover in one 30-minute talk, and not to worry, I won't attempt to do all of that. Rather, like a forester using an increment borer, my remarks today will examine a core sample of France's early modern forest history, focusing on, number one, the military and economic aims of the French crown under Louis XIV and the silvicultural practices to which they gave rise. And number two, new forest pressures that emerged in the 18th century and Enlightenment scholars' efforts to address them, notably the man known as the father of modern silviculture. I should add that my choice of France for understanding modern forestry is no mere preference, although it is that too. Rather, I argue that in their comprehensiveness and particularities, the French forest regulations that emerged from this period, as enshrined in the landmark Ordinance des Eaux et Forêts of 1669, and later the punitive and exclusionary 1827 Code Forestier, offered a blueprint of state-centered forestry that would later be transplanted and emulated elsewhere, from France's colonies in Africa and Asia to the U.S. Forest Service of Gifford Pinchot. And as many of you know, Pinchot trained at the French National Forestry School in Nancy in 1889 before establishing the Yale School of Forestry in 1900 and the U.S. Forest Service in 1905. So, beyond its own inherent interest, therefore, this legacy makes the early modern origins of France's scientific forestry worthy of consideration. So, let's get started. As in much of Europe in the medieval and early modern period, forests in France served three main purposes: fuel for heating and cooking, and timber for equipment and construction, and supplemental pasturage for livestock, including, importantly, the feeding of pigs on beech and oak mast in the autumn. This image, also of February was a tough month, I think, for people in the woodland world. This image is from the extraordinary illuminated manuscript, Les Très Riches Heures de Dutkeberry, and it reflects many of these uses. Rich or poor, the experience of huddling at the hearth to fend off winter's torments was universally shared, and the disparity between those who could afford to put another log on or not was not so great. And I just want to add that this work is one of my favorites as an illuminated manuscript, and it's actually on display right now for 3 more weeks at the Château de Chantilly, northeast of Paris. So if you're lucky enough to be there, go. It's on display until October 5th. It's not going to come back probably for a generation or two. So more or less people were on the same footing in terms of their uses of food, of wood for fuel, and for pasturage, and for timber. But starting around the middle of the 17th century, the wealth gap began to widen between those who could just afford a roof over their head and those whose appetite for conspicuous consumption, known as luxe, limitlessly grew, fed by colonial expansion, slavery, and well-placed connections. Such was the case with Nicolas Fouquet, Louis XIV's superintendent of finances, whose grandiose Chateau de Vaux-le-Vicomte put Versailles to shame. Beyond the sordid and often told tale of Fouquet's downfall, he served a feast to Louis XIV that was so over the top that it gave the king an excuse to remove him for embezzlement. The Chateau of Vaux-le-Vicomte represented a gigantic expenditure of natural resources for heating and construction, and it signaled a new era of excess, expansion, and avarice that would see France's most famous and longest-serving monarch, Louis XIV, build an even more opulent Versailles using Fouquet's design team, and pursue new territorial and maritime ambitions that entailed an ever tighter grip on the country's natural resources. Now, much of this effort and its success can be attributed to Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the Controller General of Finances and Secretary of the Navy under Louis XIV. He was also a far-sighted reformer of royal operations. To meet the Sun King's goal of challenging Dutch and English monopolies on Asian and Atlantic trade, Colbert sought to expand and reinforce naval and commercial fleets by first ensuring the viability and productivity of domestic timber resources. Surveying the sorry state of France's timber trees in the 1660s and their increasing subjugation to depredations of loups, as well as the teeth and hooves of errant livestock, Colbert launched a pioneering effort to reverse the decline of France's high forest trees and ensure a steady supply of naval timber for centuries to come, especially the large centenarian oaks that constituted ships' wooden walls. Colbert framed the effort as an imperative for the country's future. France périra faute de bois. France will perish for want of wood, he warned, fearing that a timber shortage would put the country, and more particularly the crown, at an economic and strategic disadvantage relative to its rivals. The scale of the challenge is evident in this illustration, commissioned by Colbert himself, of a ship under construction in the Toulon Naval Yard. All the components of an 84-cannon, first-rate, 3-deck ship of the line are laid out, representing the procurement of thousands of oak, fir, elm, and pine. This image from Claude Caron's 1676 Treatise on Wood for All Uses similarly itemizes each piece that goes into a ship, from the topmast to the keel, from the fir plank to the futtock. At minimum, one naval ship of the line, which was the term for the vessels from which early modern naval battles were waged, required about 2,000 oaks. But by the 18th century, that number would grow far higher, to as many as 3,000 oaks and many more trees of other species. And here is a look at the ships of the line in action. In this case, the Battle of Quiberon Bay in 1759, a French naval disaster which saw the loss of 7 ships, among them the French ship of the line Le Thésée, which capsized not through enemy attack, but through captain error, a mere 10 months after it had been launched from the port of Brest, following 3 years of construction in the naval yard. The extent of resources needed to build such vessels is hard to grasp, even with stats in hand. Based on the 1783 Encyclopédie Méthodique, one 74-gun ship of the line alone consumed 2,800 100-year-old oaks, 6,338 pines, and an innumerable quantity of other wood-derived fittings. Little wonder that warring navies preferred to capture ships rather than sink them in the heat of battle. Despite France's comparatively shallow pool of experienced naval commanders in the 17th century, France had one advantage over the Dutch and English. It was able to meet much of its maritime material needs from domestic resources. Not masts, perhaps, but the vessel itself. England and the Low Countries both relied on imports. As Keith Plumers noted last week, English imports of oak and conifers from North America began around the mid-17th century and supplemented English oak. The Dutch, meanwhile, had little timber of their own, but they controlled most of the imports from Russia and the Baltic. To fortify France's present and future navy ad infinitum, Colbert looked upstream, way up the commodity stream, to landlocked ecosystems in the French interior where trees that might someday be seaborne originated and grew. Working with a team of advisors, he set out to marshal France's timber resources through a massive overhaul of existing forest legislation and oversight. The resulting Ordinance des Eaux et Forêts, promulgated in August 1669, instituted a one-size-fits-all approach to woodland management that prioritized the Crown's interests over all other domestic or industrial applications. In particular, the Ordonnance endowed the French Navy with near monopolistic authority over the nation's hautes foutaines, or high forest trees, granting naval purveyors the right to inspect, mark, and reserve trees they considered seaworthy, be they on crown, communal, or seigneurial, that's noble, land. Especially prized was elm, which was used for ships' keels, fir for the deck planks, and above all, oaks, which comprised the crucial ribs of ships' hulls. The Ordonnance ordered the conversion of coppices, scrubby, high-density thickets grown for fuel and craftwood, into hautes foutaines, or high timber. At the same time, in keeping with the ordinance, France's newly reformed, if still not wholly effective, waters and forest regulators, the Maîtrise des Eaux et Forêts, set about curtailing the customary and communal uses like woodland grazing and gathering of firewood upon which communities relied. Much of the 1669 ordinance was devoted to detailed instructions regarding restrictions on activities and penalties for misconduct. Its few technical directives were oriented towards preserving oak. Surveyors prepared timber sales, for example, and they were instructed to reserve, quote, 10 trees in each lot of lofty growth, great vigor, and fine proportions of oak, and, if possible, of good wood and appropriate size. In keeping with oak's slow growth, moreover, the Ordonnance mandated that high timber could only be felled in 100-year rotations. And here's one of them. Preserved from the era of the Ordonnance and still growing, le chêne Montaloyer, the Montaloyer oak, is 5.45 meters in circumference and approximately 395 years old. It's in the Forêt de Tronçais in central France in the Allier. The reforms and safeguards enacted by the 1669 Ordinance would evolve into the single most influential forest law, indeed one of the most influential forest laws, or laws of any subject, in the history of France. Colbert could not have anticipated the advent of steamships, Ironsides, and steel, much less nuclear-powered submarines, but he was not wrong in recognizing that a maritime strategy reliant on slow-growing trees required a near fanatical devotion to the long game. The century that followed Colbert saw the emergence of new and growing demands on forest resources that weren't necessarily maritime, especially firewood, to meet the ravenous appetite of a growing population for heating and cooking, and in the form of wood-based charcoal to power rural industries, especially iron forges in France, but other kinds of ore elsewhere. Among those who tackled the problem were Hans Karl von Carlowitz's treatise. Carlowitz was a mining official in the German electorate of Saxony, and he took inspiration both from John Evelyn's 1662 work Silva, about which Keith spoke last week, and from the single-minded reforms of Colbert's 1669 ordinance. Integrating their ideas with his own experience as an administrator of silver mines in Freiburg, von Carlowitz wrote Silvicultura Economica, a lengthy 300-page treatise detailing his understanding of forest management for industry and articulating for the first time the concept of sustainable yield. Von Carlowitz's title page, which itself runs to over 150 words, gives an idea of his ideas as well as a taste of his rather breathless expository style. That paragraph, which is hard to make out for you there, says effectively, with God's grace, the increasing scarcity of timber can be overcome by sowing, growing, planting, and cultivation of formerly felled trees in barren wastes, and by the cultivation of broad-leaved and coniferous trees, as well as exotic species, and also how to produce charcoal, and to ensure the success of heating, building, brewing, mining, and smelting through the careful and sustained management of forest resources. So this idea of sustained yield and sustained management can be seen as deriving directly from the ideas of France preserving wood in perpetuity through the Ordinance of Colbert in the 1660s. Now, back across the border in France, Enlightenment scholars and would-be improvers also turned their attention to the country's emerging forest crisis in the 18th century. Across 3 costly wars, the Crown's naval needs continued to expand. Between 1748 and 1774 alone, the French naval fleet doubled in size from 50 to 100 vessels. It's a lot. And considering the amount of wood that went into each of them, to say nothing of the insufficiently seasoned and other poor quality trees that were let to rot after being cut, the pressure on shipyards' woodland hinterlands would have been staggering. At the same time, industrial and domestic consumption were escalating rapidly. In lengthy treatises by widely published authors and hand-penned proposals by local academy members around France, forest management became the subject of lively debate as people grappled, far more existentially than had Colbert, with the prospect of a wood famine and the urgency of balancing that wood famine with France's maritime needs. Having spent time with many of these works, I'm struck by how Enlightenment their recommendations seem to be, from the self-consciously didactic tone and firm rebuke of administrative incompetence to their faith in the rule of law, an occasional suggestion that individual initiative rather than state oversight or ecologically unsuitable regulation might offer the best remedy. Despite these Enlightenment works' often obscure focus on questions like the tensile strength of saplings, their fierce disagreement about vital practices like silvopastoralism and grazing of pigs, all of these writers and thinkers were engaged in the larger project of rational improvement, shared insight, and organizational efficiency for the public good. And in this respect, the Enlightenment advances in French forest thinking are a counterpoint to the top-down ordinance of 1669. But who had the most valuable insights, and did their contributions make any difference? I'll answer that question by looking at Another example of French silvicultural influencers, to use a contemporary term. Henri-Louis Duhamel de Monceau, a prolific writer, botanist, agronomist, and three-time president of the French Académie des Sciences, who is widely considered the father of modern silviculture, and yet whose writings are nonetheless relatively little studied. The fault almost surely lies with Duhamel's prose, which, to put it kindly, is wooden. Whereas his contemporary, the Comte de Buffon, enjoyed bestseller status in his day, Buffon's multi-volume magnum opus, the Histoire naturelle, rivaled Voltaire in popularity, had a conversational tone and colored pictures. Duhamel's instructional treatises were a tough slog, even for his most faithful followers. Duhamel de Monceau started his foray into what would become scientific forestry in 1731, when he was commissioned by the Académie des Sciences to develop standards for gathering and grading naval timber. He was subsequently appointed Inspector General of the Navy, and it was in this capacity that his interests in plant physiology and the properties of wood expanded to encompass the broader quandary of forest decline in France. Sustained warfare, incompetent and venal oversight, rapid demographic growth and industrial demand, as well as the ongoing fashion among elites for building gratuitously large chateaux, all combined to put France on the brink of forest crisis by the mid-18th century. Both in terms of timber and fuel wood, demand had begun to outstrip supply. So Duhamel, serious fellow that he was, applied himself to the problem with characteristic diligence. He launched an 8-volume series in 1755, the Traité complet des bois et forêts, the complete treatise on woods and forests. And here it is, to address every aspect of woodland cultivation and management. These volumes exemplify his conviction, like his fellow philosophe, that the starting point to improving France's forest situation and offering reform lay in the dissemination of knowledge. Duhamel de Monceau was convinced that the solution to France's forest problems lay in showing people the best way to exploit, nurture, and propagate trees for both individual gain and state glory. In his earnest but turgid prose, Duhamel surveyed forest laws, explained procedures for charcoal burning, which you can see illustrated here from one of the volumes, and endorsed planting fast-growing, lucrative exotics like maritime pine and Scots pine, both of which were valuable species for the Navy. Apparently aware of his literary limitations, Duhamel de Monceau professed in his preface, "I fear that this volume will not be favorably received by all readers. What is useful is generally serious, and what is serious is boring." Yet, Duhamel was nonetheless certain that the effort was worth it. He declared, with no small pride, "The work that I am presenting to the public is one of the most useful that one could want on the subject of the forest." Alas, usefulness and popularity are two different things. Unlike his better-known elements of naval architecture, which you can see here, Duhamel's 8-volume treatise on woods and forests ultimately failed to find a wide readership among the landowners and administrators he hoped to reach. Yet, for our purposes, his compendium, as with other would-be Enlightenment forest reformers of the 18th century, underscores the extent to which, just as today, environmental management and resource control were central foci of state debate, a focus of acrimony, debate, and intervention, with ideas aplenty and still evolving, outlooks uncertain. I want to go back for a moment and show you this pair of illustrations, because one of the things that's striking about the Duhamel de Monceau volumes is the seriousness to which they take the exploitation of woods for uses other than naval timber. In this case, on the right-hand side, you have charcoal ovens, or the burning of wood into wood-based charcoal, which was critical for forges, iron forges. And on the right, you see techniques for felling wood and also sawing them. Duhamel de Monceau's illustrations and volumes are full of this kind of didactic approach. Now, I want to call your attention, since I have a little bit of time, to perhaps one or two other examples of Enlightenment reformers in this period. Oh, that, by the way, is Duhamel de Monceau's naval vessel, and you get a sense of the scale here, this being a ship of the line of the mid-18th century. It would have been, roughly 3,000 oaks alone just to make those hulls. But how did they actually make those hulls? And that's the image I want to show you next here from the Encyclopédie Méthodique of 1797. The Encyclopédie Méthodique was one of these rational Enlightenment projects where they sought to show and tell people how to do everything. How to fish salt cod, how to fish for cod, how to make nails a la Adam Smith, and also how exactly one would get the naval ribs, knees, and buttocks that were not produced through, injection molding as one might today, but rather they had to be found in the natural growth of trees, branches, and trunks. And also, another Enlightenment reformer and visionary of the period, the Marquis de Vauban, an innovator in fortification design under the Louis XIV monarchy, who facilitated the eastward expansion of France's borders into Alsace and Lorraine and Franche-Comté, as well as the spread of overseas claims in North America, India, and the Indian Ocean. Like Colbert, the Marquis de Vauban played an essential role in the rise of silviculture in the service of the military. But, like Colbert also, Vauban was keenly aware of the importance of forests to his work. In a treatise on forest cultivation that he wrote in 1701, he lamented that some areas of France were, quote, entirely lacking in wood, and that even the Crown's forest officers were brazenly flouting restrictions on felling. Many older forests, if not to say all, he lamented, are ruined and in a pitiful state. Unlike most provincial governors and even many royal forest administrators, Vauban had personally visited the woods throughout France to obtain construction materials and to assess their viability and utility for his projects. And in his opinion, the solution to France's forest timber shortage could be found in encouraging wealthy nobles to set aside acreage for planting trees so that, as he wrote, there would be plenty of new forests, incomparably more beautiful and better than those which presently exist. This is similar to the plan envisioned by John Evelyn across the English Channel in 1662, but like that one, Vauban's voluntary planting scheme did not come to fruition, even as his fortifications, like this one at Neuf-Brisach in Alsace, have stood the test of time. Finally, I want to cast forward in the last minute or two of my talk and offer a sense of where the direction goes. Now, I'm leaping forward by about 75 years here, but by the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, those combination of pressures that I discussed, naval timber and the strict regulation of the forests, communal noble, and state forests for the primary interest of maritime development, the growth of the ore smelting industry, and the needs of a growing population, which massively grew in the second half of the 18th century. Massive conflicts ensued, which would give rise to a main focus on forest issues in the French Revolution. These continued without resolution all the way through the height of the First French Republic, and then the First Empire under Napoleon, but ultimately saw some resolution, if you can call it that, under the establishment of the Code Forestier of 1827, which got its start first by that emphasis on education. In this case, the establishment of the first French forestry school at Nancy in 1826. And the whole modus operandi of the French forestry school was about strict reform, rigid enforcement of prescriptive and prohibitive forest laws, and also a kind of militarist approach to protecting and defending the interests of the French state against those along their edge, the rural communities, who might actually try to use them. And that's those kinds of conflicts that ensue are the subject of my current book project. You can see here these forestry school students in uniform in the 19th century. It wasn't so long after this, maybe about another 50 years, that Gifford Pinchot would show up to spend some months at Nancy and later tour Switzerland. Well, I'm going to leave it at that today. I hope I've given you some ideas and insights about the origins and directions of French forestry, especially its state-centered directions over the course of the 17th and 18th and even the 19th century. I would be happy to entertain any questions you might have, and thank you for listening. I'm going to stop share.
Thank you so much for that excellent talk. And also your slides are just really interesting and wonderful. So thank you. It was a real treat. We do have some questions from the audience. And I'm actually going to combine two questions to get us started. And one part of the question is about kind of how the ordinance and these restrictions were messaged to common people that were used to maybe collecting firewood in the forest or bringing their livestock into the forest. What was the messaging around these new kinds of restrictions that would ultimately bring in changes? And then I'm going to combine this with a question that Steve asked, which is a great question around, I'll just read his question. He wants to know whether there were efforts made in early modern French discussions to connect the waste of wood or poor forest management to a lack of patriotism or nationalism or allegiance to the crown.
The waste of wood. Okay.
Yeah,
Right. Those
and poor forest management, how those two
okay.
elements, if they were messaged as a lack of patriotism.
Okay, well, I'll take the first one. The question of patriotism is a temporally later one, so I'll take that one second. So the messaging is kind of a funny, like contemporary concept. But let's see. So regular everyday people, the way that they had rights and access to the forest in the early modern period derived from charters that in many places went back to the 10th century, 11th, 12th centuries, when feudal landlords were trying to get people to settle and stick around in their regions so that they would have people to till the soil. And as a sweetener, rural communities or villages, hamlets, were offered certain rights, droit d'usage, use rights, that consisted usually of something called affouage, which was an allocation of timber once a year, the right to graze certain kinds of animals, but not goats. Goats are very naughty. but they come into the picture. And also allocations of firewood and other kinds of gathering rights. But by the 17th century, those kinds of pretty humble usages are getting lots of scrutiny. It seems outrageous when you compare the scale of vol-au-vent to the ways that rural people were, using one bundle of sticks to heat themselves, and that couldn't have gone far. But there was the picture. It was not only the French crown, but also noble landowners who were basically pushing back and scaling back on those charters, claiming that they didn't exist if there was no written record, claiming that tradition wasn't good enough, oral tradition didn't hold up. And so people got the message because they were being excluded by noble landlord, private landowners, owned forest guards, and by the guards of the state. Now, in practice, sometimes there was a lot of collusion going on. The guards oftentimes came from the communities themselves, and this was one of the major reforms of the 1827 Forest Code, that guards at that point were veterans of the Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars. But the messaging, to the extent there was any, was simply the rules have changed and you can't have what you thought you could. I also want to underscore that, when I say community, it's not like everybody got nice things together. It wasn't all of a collective. Women who were widowed were in particularly out of luck. There was very uneven access to these use rights. So it's not like they were one, happy anarchist collective. But I think that answers question number one. Now, question number two about was it unpatriotic? Was it considered unpatriotic to, commit gaspillage or waste of forest resources? So that doesn't come really until the revolution. The whole notion of a patria, of a, adherence or allegiance to nation is really a phenomenon of the French Revolution. Were people, thought to be betraying their king or their crown because they were, doing a little nibbling on the side? No. Everyone, from what I have read, there was a sense of commitment to community, and if you were following the rules and the rights of the community, like, for example, the people who were really looked harshly upon were noble landlords who were trying to muscle in on those use rights and would claim that they too, as nobles, had rights to their own land, and therefore they could send a flock of 50 sheep in compared to the community's, 10 sheep. So there was a lot of resentment, but I wouldn't call it regard for those behaviors as unpatriotic. After the revolution begins, however, there's this very interesting phenomena that happens, which you can, y'all can go back and read my first book about it. But there's this very interesting phenomenon that happens, which is that rural communities who have been subject to this increasingly harsh set of restrictions, they regard the revolution, the idea of liberté, égalité, fraternité, propriété, they regard that as their moment to actually finally have the liberty to use the forest as they need to benefit their livelihoods. And that is not at all the kinds of liberty and equality and property protection that is eventually implemented by the centralized French state. It gets worse under Napoleon. It gets way worse under the 1827 Forest Code, but, spoiler alert, coal and and it's a change of energy regimes eventually helps divert the problem but not till the 1840s or 50s.
Great, thank you, Kieko. Okay, we are getting lots of questions. We'll get to as many as we can. We may not get to everyone's questions, but we will keep going. All right, so here's a question from Turner, and he says, it's interesting how navies attempted to capture ships instead of sink them. He wonders, was this a form of knowledge theft or more simply a need to reduce resource extraction or both?
I think there was a little bit of both. There was definitely a kind of piracy where, especially I've read about this in the 17th centuries, when ships of the line were innovating, where people would go as spies and try to like get into each other's, like get into the English naval yards or vice versa in the Netherlands or with the Low Countries or in France. So there was some knowledge theft in that respect. And certainly if you managed to capture a ship, you'd get a pretty good look at what they were doing. But I think in the heat of a ship of the line face off, it was really about, damn, we can get this ship and we can, use it against our enemy in the next round of fighting.
You. Okay, I'm going to combine. There's a couple of questions that came in around sort of acreage, just given the kind of the resource intensiveness of shipbuilding. And Kyle asks, I'm curious how many acres, hectares of forest it took at the time to produce the timber needed for those ships. So that's the first question, and you can take these as you want. And then the second question is around sort of percentage of rural land that was used. So let me actually read it exactly. Steve asks, were there efforts? No, sorry, here we go. What, if any, estimates were there of the overall needs by acreage of woods and its percentage used for forest or overall rural land?
Ooh, okay. Those
And
questions make my
acreage
head hurt.
questions.
Yeah, my brain is hurting. I wish I had those statistics. That would be awesome. But I don't have the answers of how many hectares it would take to produce, say, a 74 gun ship of the line, nor do I have an assessment of the extent of rural land that was used to, overall France. What I will say is that the 1669 ordinance applied to all of France's forests. And this is one of the things that made it such a target at the time of the revolution, which was that noble landowners and bourgeois landowners who became the big, most affluent force, thanks to slavery and trade off the back of colonized subjects in the 18th century, bourgeois landowners, nobles of recent vintage, really resented the imposition of the ordinance on their land. They didn't like naval purveyors showing up and saying, I'll take that oak, thank you very much. So yes, it covered the whole country. How much of the country did it actually affect? I think it's hard, it's sort of mind-boggling to think of a single ship requiring 2,800 oaks of 100 to 200 years in age. I can't really picture that, but what is interesting is that despite these cries of timber famine, France is, even at the lowest point of its forest cover in, say, 1792 to 1794, it's still a very, very forested country. It's still one of the most forested countries in Europe today. And that low point of forest cover during the revolution, it still doesn't lose its gigantic trees. It's, in fact, one of the reasons why I chose to study France, because it's just so great to go around in those forests. So sorry, I don't have those stats, but if anybody can get them, I'd be just totally lovely to hear them.
Thank you. All right. We are getting questions fast and furious. Hugh asks, how were the ordinances enforced? Were there special agents who oversaw harvesting?
Yes, so the Ordonnance des Eaux et Forêts was basically there was an existing structure in France called the Maîtrise des Eaux et Forêts that had this the masters of the woods and forest, or the waters and the forests. And the Masters of Waters and Forests was its own kind of regulatory body or enforcement body that consisted of nobles who went out and did surveys. And, they would mark trees and measure trees. And then these naval purveyors could also go after the ordinance. The problem with the maîtrise of the waters and forest, the masters, is that these were yet another one of these venal offices that during the time of Louis XIV, and it got way worse afterwards, these were offices that were just sold to the highest bidder. And so you might get a maître who was really assiduous and actually capable of his job. And you might get another one who wanted no part of the misery and travel of 6 months a year touring around the district to which he was assigned. And there was a lot of misappropriation, graft. This is why in the 18th century you have all these kind of critiques by people like Duhamel de Monceau and other philosophes who are saying, look, you've got all these laws, but they're not enforced in any way. The people who are supposedly enforcing them are just making profit. So yes, there were forest officers, and in addition to the ones doing the assessment and surveys, if they did it at all, there was also a whole kind of structure or phalanx of guards.
Great, thank you. All right. Next question. Are you aware of any knowledge transfer from indigenous societies the French colonizers encountered in the Americas that might have influenced France's development of Enlightenment ideas about the management of nature and fundamental relationships to the natural world and the products of nature? Example, the idea of sustained yield. So did contact with the New World change how Enlightenment, forest management happened?
Forest management, I would say less so than the English experience, where it's much more explicit. Certainly if you look at Rousseau, Rousseau's discourses, first and second discourse, there's a lot of kind of amazement at the Huron, Iroquois peoples who are living in, model kind of self-sustaining, seemingly democratic, small societies. And this is the ideas upon which he, establishes his whole kind of political outlook of a more egalitarian society. It has to be small, it has to be nimble, it has to be collective. Does he say much? Does Rousseau say so much about nature? Not so much. I don't know of examples that are explicit about forests in particular, but there are lots of comments on how big and healthy and strong people are and how their teeth are really great and how there's abundance. Of course, almost everyone going to the New World, in the 16th and 17th centuries, particularly in the 16th centuries, just is amazed at the level of abundance. Maybe they're trying to, sell their story, but it's not all made up.
Thank you. All right, we have another question. This question is from Jason, and he asks, how did thinkers like Dumonceau get this knowledge of forest products? Were they discussing and borrowing techniques from tradespeople like other Enlightenment scientists at the time?
Yeah, so that's a really good question because actually Duhamel de Monceau and the Comte de Buffon, who was his rival, they had this whole kind of like interpersonal and intellectual rivalry. Buffon won. But both Buffon and Duhamel de Monceau and many other people, Réaumur, Vauban, they were also noble landlords. And so how did they get their ideas of forestry? Well, they were doing all kinds of experimentation at their own estates. And Duhamel de Monceau was quite an innovator in trying out new species. Another philosopher I didn't mention in my talk, Rea Moore, who slightly predates him, was doing all kinds of studies on the tensile strength of wood and kind of like different kinds of ligneous fiber. So they were scientists. And I don't get the sense that there was a lot of like consulting of other, like the man on the street who's selling wood. I think there was a fair bit of conferring among their own milieu, however.
Thank you. All right, I think we have time for maybe one more. Here's a question about invasive or non-native species. The question is, it's interesting that early history of forest management includes the import, planting, growth, and use of non-native, non-local species as an answer for reducing loss of native species and forest acreage. Are there records of areas planted in the 17th and 18th centuries in France for specific exotic species? And which of those have become invasive in those areas and across France since then? So it's basically asking about the legacy of planting these non-native species.
Yeah, that's a great question and a good subject for a study. I don't actually, I don't, I don't study forests in the present so much. Uh, I do know that the experimentation with species from elsewhere, whether it was elsewhere on the European continent or increasingly, in the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, exotics from the New World, quote unquote, New World, that this was very common. I mean, this was in fact arguably the intention of a lot of these travels. It wasn't necessarily to replace the loss of native species. Rather, it was because, hey, this might be a really great tree that we could use, for example, to make a better keel. Elm was favored for keels because of its water resistant properties, but maybe there could be something that would grow faster or be even more solid, like mahogany. From elsewhere. So did they become invasive? I mean, there's lots of things that become invasive. There probably are. There certainly are diseases and tree diseases that become invasive. And that's a whole other story in the 19th century with, phylloxera crisis and all kinds of issues that the oyster die off on the Atlantic coast and so forth. There's a whole history of invasive species and how it affects France in the 19th century. But to the extent the trees become invasive, I do not know. So would love to hear it if somebody knows.
Great. So to be continued. All right. Well, that is the time we have. Kieko, thank you again so much for doing this for us. It was a fabulous talk and great Q&A. Really, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for all those wonderful questions.
Thanks to the audience. Okay, so just a couple of wrap-up comments. We ask that you please continue to join us for more in this series on Thursdays from 12 to 1 Eastern Time. Next week, we'll hear from Martin Behmen. Martin is a lecturer in the history department at the University of Freiburg in Germany, and his talk is titled "The Times They're a-Changin': Industrialization, Globalization, and Forestry in Central Europe around 1900. As a quick reminder as well, recordings of today's presentation will be available within a few days on the Yale Forest Forum website. The slight delay in posting those is because it gives us a bit more time to accurately caption each session, which makes them more accessible to all. Slides will also be made available and, when possible, referenced with documents and readings that will also be listed on the Yale Forest Forum website. So check back for that.